Does the constant barrage of violent images from Afghanistan and the Middle East influence the way Americans think about Islam? You better believe it. We'll talk about that next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Hello and welcome to Global Perspectives. As a result of 9/11, questions have swirled around Islam, with particular reference to whether or not the religion is violent. One study finds 1 American out of 4 believes Islam espouses hatred and violence, but only 2% are very knowledgeable about the religion. Another survey reports that most Muslims feel 9/11 made it more difficult to be a Muslim in the United States. Stories of profiling and harassment based on religion are all too common.
We have a police department that's out of control.
Can the gap be bridged? Amitabh Pal is the managing editor of the Progressive magazine and author of a new book, Islam Means Peace, Understanding the Muslim Principle of Nonviolence Today. His goal is to sort through the confusion and misperceptions about the religion by documenting what he terms its rich tradition of nonviolence, from the historical sources of Islam to recent protest movements in the Middle East and North Africa. He provides a sweeping perspective on Islam. Hello, Mr. Pal, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, John. It's my pleasure.
Tell us, you're a veteran journalist. You've covered any number of issues over the years, but now you've decided to write a book on Islam. How did that happen?
A number of things, John. I grew up partly in India, and people may not know this, but India has either the second or the third largest population of Muslims in the world, depending on how you do the counting. My neighbors were Muslim, my friends were Muslim, and it appalled me in the aftermath of September 11th that Islam was being reduced to this violent, inherently intolerant religion. I wrote for the magazine on a couple of Muslim pacifists that led me to a deeper interest in the issue, and that eventually led to the book.
Now, some people assume that you're Muslim because you've written this book on Islam, but that's not the case.
Not at all, John. And, I'm from a Hindu tradition, but I know a fair amount about Islam. Islam is a significant presence in India, more so in the portion of India my family is from. Lucknow, which is the capital of the biggest state in India, and which is where I went to college, is a significant center of Muslim culture historically and currently. And so I've come to know a lot about the religion. And of course, my research made me learn a lot more.
Now, why is it, you talk in the book about misperceptions that people have about Islam, and that these have actually been in place for many, many years and were exacerbated by the tragedy of 9/11. Why do you think there have been these misperceptions, and how might we go about correcting them? Obviously reading the book, as you suggest, but more broadly, how do we educate people about issues such as Islam?
Yes, John. I think what's been happening is, a certain amount of ignorance. So only half of Americans know that the Quran is the holy book of Islam, which I think is such a basic fact about the religion, and yet Americans have very strong perceptions or misperceptions of Islam based on certain violent events and relentless media coverage of these events, especially September 11th. And all of that has sort of contributed to this idea of Islam being violent, intolerant, even terroristic. And the way to correct it is to get your information from a wide variety of sources, to learn about these wonderful non-violent movements in Muslim history back in the 1930s, 40s, more recently in countries ranging from Pakistan to the Maldives in the Indian Ocean to Kosovo, and of course now the Arab Spring.
Tell us about your own family connections to Islam in the context of this nonviolent tradition. going back to what you touched on briefly in India?
Well, actually, the neighborhood we grew up in was a microcosm of India. We had Christian neighbors, Muslim neighbors, and in India it's fairly well known, although sadly it's increasingly being forgotten there too, about all these wonderful Muslims who were with Gandhi and were his colleagues and friends in the movement that gave India independence, which is perhaps the best known example of non-violent mass movement in modern history at least. And Gandhi himself grew up around Muslims, had Muslim school friends, had a Muslim employer when he was in South Africa, when he was a lawyer, and later on, as I said, had a number of Muslims who participated with him in the non-violent mass movement that gave India independence.
What can we learn from those early examples of nonviolence that would be applicable and useful today?
The foremost of Gandhi's colleagues was a person named Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who had a Pashtun movement based in the same region of Afghanistan, Pakistan, that the Taliban have been based, a region that's thought to be now synonymous with terrorism and intolerance, gave rise to this wonderful movement of 100,000 Pashtuns called the Servants of God, dedicated to religious tolerance, to non-violence, to interfaith harmony, to women's rights, to social reform, and all of it derived from the Quran, Islam, and the Prophet Muhammad, all the sources of Islam themselves. Incredible example, and one that's so little known in the West.
What would you say is the most popular, most common misperception that people have of Islam?
Well, you know, I always aim not to, I tell people, my aim is not to whitewash Islam as much as to complicate it. So the most common misperception is that the Quran is an inherently violent, intolerant book, and that Islam is an inherently violent, intolerant religion. I say if you look at the sources, and my early chapters deal with that, the Quran has a number of passages enjoining compassion, mercy, forgiveness, forbearance, good interfaith relations. The word mercy or its derivatives appear 300 times in the Quran, for example. Every time God is praised, He's the most merciful, the most benevolent. All of this is absent in the American imagination about the Quran, and I think that needs to be rectified.
And how do you, again, we touched on this, but how do you get people to understand these interpretations?
Well, they just have to sort of, read further and read deeper and consult a variety of sources. I'm lucky that I beat a competitor, so to speak, by a few months. There's been another book on the subject by Arsalan Iftikhar, which came out just a month or two ago. I haven't yet had a chance to take a look at it. There are wonderful case studies of Ghaffar Khan, wonderful biographies of Indian nationalist Muslims who were with Gandhi, of the movement in Kosovo. And now there's been a fair amount written about the Arab Spring. But people have to delve beneath the surface and really look for these sources and educate themselves.
Now, this book started well before the Arab Spring phenomenon, but I guess in many ways that has complemented what you're trying to do by providing new examples.
Absolutely, John. I joke, and here I'm being facetious, that the book was simultaneously very timely and made slightly dated by the Arab Spring. And in fact, just when I was putting the finishing touches on the book, and Prager, the publisher, and I were engaging in this back and forth on the final proofs that Tunisia and then Egypt and then the rest of the Arab Spring happened. And I told them, hey, look, can we delay the book by a bit? And they said, alas, it's too late at this stage. But now you're right. So now when I speak about non-violence in Muslim societies, I don't get this perennially sort of quizzical or sort of blank look. People know at least a bit what I'm talking about.
Tell us about a concept in Islam, the concept of jihad. This is most commonly associated with the religion, and usually in a negative way. Tell us, based on your research, what your interpretation is of jihad and what the interpretation is on behalf of many Muslims.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, John, because jihad, sadly, is the term that first springs to people's minds when they think about Islam. Jihad, far from what people think they know about it, does not mean war. It does not mean violence. It means struggle. And the struggle can be the greatest struggle, which is within yourself to improve yourself as a good Muslim, or it can be the lesser struggle, which is the struggle to defend Islam from its enemies. Even the lesser struggle, which obviously is the more violent one, has clear guidelines and rules, which include not harming non-combatants, even sparing vegetation, being very careful about who you attack, and adhering to just this whole notion of the just war, which is, its analogy in the Christian doctrine. And yet, people associate it with the most horrible, sort of reprehensible version of Islam, and that's because Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have hijacked the concept of jihad.
Well, and of course, in many religions, there are concepts like this that are subject to interpretation, and depending on the person or the group that is interpreting them, you can get a different definition and a justification for your action. So even though a few individuals may have acted as perpetrators in the instance of 9/11 and other attacks, it's not the sentiment on the part of the majority.
Absolutely. I have a poll in my book which shows that the majority of Muslims perceive jihad as the internal struggle, not as a call to take up arms. And it was a multi-country survey, and only one country in it, oddly enough, the country which is associated with the most relaxed version of Islam, Indonesia, did the majority of Muslims think of jihad as the lesser struggle, which is the struggle to defend Islam from its enemies. And I'm so glad you brought up that point about a holy book or any book being subject to different interpretations. Bhagavad Gita, which is the holy book of Hinduism, can be read and interpreted as a call to arms because Krishna, the Hindu god, is telling Arjun that he's justified in waging a just war. Gandhi interpreted it allegorically in a really pacifist way. The person who killed him interpreted it violently in the traditional manner. And Nathuram Godse and his co-conspirator Apte went to the gallows holding a copy of the Gita each when they were hanged. So this shows you the most incredible proponent of pacifism ever, perhaps, Mahatma Gandhi, and his assassins had such different interpretations of the same holy book.
On the other hand, if you're trying to use Islam as a tool to achieve your politically violent ends, this is a great way to rouse, motivate, and inspire people to your side. And on the other side of the discussion, it's very easy for critics to seize this violent interpretation of jihad and make it part of their repertoire of criticism.
Absolutely. Developing countries often are very religious. Muslim countries are no exception. And often political struggles are given this overlay of religion. Even secular figures like Saddam Hussein, etc., in the end, in their desperation, have fallen back on Islam. Often it's just a desperate gimmick. But what then happens is it makes it seem that these are religious struggles, while at their core, at their essence, they are actually political struggles, which have been given this overlay of religion to make it appealing to Muslims.
Well, how do you address another question which is related? Many of the critics of political violence that's done in the name of Islam wonder why the majority allows this to happen. If it's just a tiny percentage of adherents who believe in this violent path, why is it that the majority doesn't say enough, stand up and prevent this from happening?
Well, the real question is how. I mean, it's difficult, I think. And there have been condemnations of September 11th by clerics throughout the Muslim world. The problem also is that there is no central authority per se. It's very diffuse. And as for the ordinary Muslim, I think he or she is too busy living out the jihad, the struggle of sort of daily living, to confront these violent extremists and who are of course, by the very definition, armed and hostile and violent, and to take them on, in practice, actually quite difficult to sort of, to push back and say, look, this is a completely wrong version of our religion that you're propagating, and you're contributing to this misperception globally about Islam.
And I guess it depends significantly on where you live. I've seen and heard many Muslims, from the average person to leaders in the United States, speaking publicly and strongly in condemnation of political violence, but in other countries that may not be so easy.
Absolutely, and there have been clerics, as I said, who have spoken out against the Taliban, against Al-Qaeda, and have been subjected to repeated attacks. You know that the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan have bombed Sufi shrines again and again and again. Why is that? Because Sufism stands for love, for tolerance, for interfaith harmony, all of which, of course, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are dead set against. So, it makes it so difficult when your life is on the line to speak out publicly and repeatedly against these forces of extremism.
I know this is probably impossible to quantify, but in the United States, people love to quantify everything. Are we making progress in the war against terrorism? How do we measure it? Are we making progress in the effort to reverse the recession? How do we measure it? Are we making progress with this issue? Have you noticed ups and downs in dealing with this misperception of Islam, and where do you think we're headed?
If we were having this conversation even 2 or 3 years ago, John, I would say that we were making progress. Now it's become more complicated. I think there has been some regression, at least in the past couple of years, in the perception of Islam. Some of it has been linked to the controversy around the Interfaith Center near Ground Zero. Some of it has been linked to this perception of President Obama being Muslim. But there has been a degeneration, a worsening of overall American perception of Islam, and even Muslims themselves, Muslim Americans, have reported a rise between 2007 and 11 in cases of harassment, at airports, of mosques being defaced or vandalized. So there has been sliding back, sadly enough, in the past couple of years.
And yet, for more than a year, most recently, we've had the ongoing saga of the Arab Spring, which has been inspiring to a lot of people. And it seems that with those examples of nonviolent protest, it might contribute to understanding.
You're right, and I would be hoping that. And I think in a certain sense, it has led to a more complex view of the Middle East. But then, Egypt and Tunisia were mostly nonviolent. Libya, much less so. Syria, less so. So even that has become sort of, a bit complex. And then there has been all this, in my view, scaremongering about fundamentalist Muslim parties taking over in Egypt and Tunisia, who will be akin to the Taliban. And so even the initial positive effect of the Arab Spring, I think, has been worn out over time. And I think, as I said, the overall perception of Islam in the United States has been steadily becoming more negative in the past couple of years. One statistic that I'd like to present to your viewers, almost 3 in 10 Americans in a poll last March, after the Arab Spring already had begun, think American Muslims to be sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. Now, this is not Americans thinking American Muslims to be too hardline or too fundamentalist, but sympathetic to the worst terrorist organization in the world. So I think we have a lot of work to do.
We have a lot of work to do. The book chapters, each one could be its own book. Was there any part of this that has inspired you to think about another project where you would develop one or more of the chapters into another work or body of research?
Well, if the publishers will have me, I would love to do a sequel, so to speak, focusing on the Arab world and, these movements, especially in Egypt and Tunisia, that by people power managed to topple long-standing dictators, Hosni Mubarak and Zine Abidine Ben Ali. I would hope that I could get the financing to go there and actually interview people, do on-the-ground research, and come out perhaps with another book focusing just on the Arab Spring.
I think we need a lot more insight on that subject, and unfortunately we were ill-served in general by the various sources of information in this country before the beginning of the Arab Spring, so that we weren't really prepared for that phenomenon. And now the coverage is still relatively limited because we have so few specialists from here who are on the scene, and we lost one of them recently with the passing of Anthony Shadid. How do you get more of that information moving into the mainstream? Is there any way to move the mass media in that direction of taking up its role of educating as well as, you know, informing and providing the latest news?
Well, I think the print media has generally been better. The New York Times has provided some good coverage, of course, and the late Anthony Shadid was among the best examples. Television has sadly sort of, you know, fallen down on the job generally. There's much more of sort of, you know, much more heat, little light. And, you know, there's much more sort of this gap fest and scaremongering about what may happen, might happen, little on-the-ground reporting. There have been some wonderful websites. There's one I would specially recommend called Middle East Report, which is a quarterly publication, but they have merip.org, MERIP.org. So people can go online and find out much more about this incredibly complex phenomenon called the Arab Spring. I would think that cable television still leaves a lot to be desired.
Sure. And where are the opinion leaders in this subject? You work with a service that helps shape opinions, ideally, around the country, and is that having an impact?
Oh, I would hope so, in its own small way. Unfortunately, from a significant number of politicians, prominent politicians, there has been this fear-mongering about the Middle East now being less sympathetic to the US with the advent of democracy, rather than when they had these stable sort of, you know, US allied dictators. So I think that's had an impact on public opinion, for example. The Obama administration itself has been somewhat ambivalent. So that ambivalence has led to confusion in the minds of the public. And then even the media, I think, as I said, has fallen short in doing a real good job in portraying the complex reality of what's been happening over the past year and a half.
Now, you write on this from time to time. Are there any pieces coming up in the near future on this topic? The tradition of nonviolence in Islam and the Arab Spring and related matters?
Well, I would recommend to people, and here I'm tooting my own horn, our special issue, the December-January issue of the Progressive, it's a special issue on nonviolent activism globally. And we have a number of dispatches from countries such as Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Greece, Chile, just from all over the world. And it's an incredible effort that we managed to put together on our shoestring budget. And I would urge people to take a look at that.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for joining us today, Mr.
Thanks for having me on. It was my pleasure.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.